Hello guys, welcome back. In this video, we are implementing an authentication middleware to protect our routes. So let's go ahead and create a file here called auth.middleware.ts. So we're going to protect our routes that need a user to be logged in and registered on our system before they can access those routes. So that's the reason why we need to have an authentication middleware. Unlike with registering and logging in, you don't need to have a token to be able to access those routes, but then there's gonna be routes that you need to present a token before we can allow you to access them. So that's the importance of having this middleware. User auth not a request next function, and we're going to have a try catch function here, a try catch block. And then in a case where there's an error, new app error, we have a class, so we are instantiating it here and passing it into the next function here and say user. So in a case where there's an error, so we're gonna assume that that user is not authorized, so they are not allowed to access whatever protected route they were trying to access. User is not authorized. So what we're going to need is we're going to need to grab the authorization header here. In the authorization header here, we're expecting to have content in this format, bearer and some token here. So we are only interested in this token, right? So let's ensure that this authorization token is in the correct, this authorization header is in the correct format, right? So let's grab it, header. So we need to ensure that this header is not undefined, or we also need to ensure that whatever this header, this authorization header, start with this word bearer and followed by a space, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to say header starts with, there's a function called start with, and then we can say, so if this header, this authorization header does not start with this bearer, it means this user cannot access that particular route they were trying to access. So we can copy this line here and paste it here. User is not authorized. So we say, so basically this means this authorization header here did not contain this bearer, or did not follow this format, or it didn't even exist at all. So we had an undefined value, right? And so if all this is false, so we should be able to access our token. So now we can have the token from split, because we believe the format of this authorization is going to be something like this. It's going to be of something like this. So we are splitting it, and we get the value in index 1. So now we can take this token and confirm if this token was signed by our application, right? But before I actually do that, I need us to change something from the user's controller here. The way we sign our token, I want it to be something like this: user ID, save. Also, let's do the same thing for our register function here. So I want us to pass in an object with the user ID property, right? Instead of just passing that property without having to specify what is it, right? So we say this object contains a property called user ID, and then the same thing here, and no. Also, We don't need the code because we have already specified here. We just say status success, and then also here success is true. So for every case where we throw an exception, the success flag here will be false, because inside the error handler we specified that the success is false, right? So I think everything is cool in here. Let's go back here, and now that we have this token, we can go ahead and verify if indeed it was signed by our application. How do we do that? Let's come in here. We have a verify token function here, so it expects a token that it needs to verify, and then we're gonna grab that and return. There is a function called verify which takes in the token and also takes in this the secret key that we had in our .env file. So that's what we have in here. So we can go back in our auth middleware and say verify user and verify token, and we pass in this token here. Actually, let's just say verify token. So no, we cannot verify. So if this verify function returns the payload, so this verify function will return the payload that we assigned here, or we signed here. So this payload will be returned in a case where indeed this token was signed by us. So what did we attach to this token, or what was the payload in our token? The payload in our token is the one that is in here. Where is it? Here's our payload. So if that token was sent by us, we should be able to access the user ID like this, right? So this is the value, and then we're going to access it using this property user.id. So how do we do that? Let's grab it. Actually, now that we have that user ID in here, we can grab the user. Await users dot. Let me try to import it and find one. So we're going to try to find the user that has verify dot user ID. So if this verify return that payload will be user ID with the value here. So if you manage to grab that payload, we are trying to access this ID and we are getting that user, right? And now that we have that user, we can check if that user exists, right? So if user does not exist, then it means there's a problem. Copy here, paste, and we need the async here. What's the problem? Cannot find verify. Wait a minute. What happened? Yes, that's the value that I need here. So if this user does not exist, I'm copying this line and I'm pasting it here, and plus the await key here needs the async. What's the problem now? Yeah, okay, we fixed that. Let's save. So we check if we have the header, and then the header indeed starts with the word bearer and with some space, and then so if this is false, we grab the token by splitting this header, because the format would be like this. We split it and then we get the value that is at index 1, and then we try to verify it, and then this verify will contain the payload, or this is actually the payload. Let me say payload here and say payload. So this payload contains this user ID, and then we are using this user ID to grab the user from our database. So if that user with this ID does not exist, we say this user is not authorized for this. What's the problem? User does not exist on, what can I say? Can I do this? So if that user does not exist on our database, so we assume the user cannot be allowed to access that route. So we throw an error and we pass it into our next function, which should be handled by the error handler. So in a case where this user exists, we want to attach it to the request object or the request interface here, so that other middlewares can be able to access that user information. So we're going to access passing like this, but there's a problem. There's a problem because we cannot assign user to this user property on this request object, because this user does not exist. So what do we need to do? We need to create a file called custom.ts. So in here we're going to use declaration matching, that we extend the definition of express and the request object, because the request object is from express. So we're going to extend their definition and attach a property on that request object or request interface. So we're going to say declare namespace. So the request object or the request interface is in the namespace express. So we're going to say this interface request should have a user property, and then the property type, this property user should be of type any. So with this, we are basically saying now the request object or the request interface from express will have a property called user with the type any. And then you can even use any type from here, but then we're just going to use type any. And then if you go back into our auth middleware, you should see we no longer have an error, right? So now that we have attached this user to this user property, we can go to the next middleware. And that's it. This is basically our authentication middleware, right? Split the header and grab the token, add index 1, verify token function returns the payload from our token, returns the payload that was signed to the token, and the payload contains an ID, a user ID, verify if user exists, and attach user from database to the request interface. Move to the next middleware. So yeah, I hope this comment help if there's a bit of confusion, right? So we have this, okay. We should be able to test our authentication middleware, I think. But then before we actually do that, I need us to go into the index. Let's create a file here. Actually, not a file, a route. App.get home, you are at home, right? So this is basically, this is the like a simple route, right? So what you, when you go to here, when you go to this route, it should return a message with you are at home. So we can now go ahead and run this project and test our authentication middleware here. So let me open the terminal. Actually, before we run it, since we have added our own custom types, so we need to attach a file, I mean not a file, a flag to our node that we have added our own custom types. If you don't do this, you are going to get an error. So let's go ahead and run this. So we have connected our database and then we are running. So let's open up Postman and test what we have added so far. Let's add a new request. So what I need us to do, actually, let's register a new user, right? Testing client, let's say it's test. So we have registered the user, and then now we can grab this token, right? Let me delete this one. So in this request, we are going to make a request. We're going to make a request to home, and it's a get request, right? So let's send a request. You see, you get a message says you are at home. So how can we protect this? How can we protect this route? You come here, go back to index. So before this route, you're going to add our authentication middleware that we implemented, auth user auth. So what's the problem? So every route under this user auth middleware is protected. So if you put a route under this middleware here, will be protected, because what Express does is it reads the request from top to bottom. So before it actually gets to this route, it will have to go through this middleware, and then once it gets to this middleware, this is where we are actually trying to confirm if indeed this user is allowed to access whatever is below this middleware, right? So let's see. So let's wait for it to run. Okay, now it's running. So if you go back to Postman, we should not be able to access this UR at home. You see, so now let's try to log in, right? So let's log in and grab the token, and then so that we can present it when we make a request to a protected route, right? So we have a login here. The email is going to be test@test.com. What was the password? The password is testing123. So let me save this and close it. Let's make a request to log in. So we get a token, right? So we get this token. So now it means if you go back here, let me save this login function, I mean this login request. So if you go back to this request, if you attach a bearer token here, if you attach this bearer token here, actually let me not attach anything. So let's send it again. User is not authorized. Let's attach a random token. User is not authorized. So what about a token that actually is valid? you are at home. So in a case where the token is indeed valid, it means you are allowed to access this part of our application. So everything or every route under this middleware here is protected. You cannot access it before accessing this, and then this middleware will ensure that everything or every request that has to go every request that needs to go to a protected route will have to go through it and ensure that indeed the user is valid and can access that particular route. And then the other thing here from this authentication middleware, you might have seen that we attach this request. We have attached user to this request interface, right? So what this means is that we can now use this user information or this particular user in the next middleware without having to make a request to the database, right? So let me show you example, right? Let's go back here. So we can assume that this is our next middleware, right? After this, so it means if you do this and say user and go into the request and say user, we should be able to access the user information that we attached in the authentication middleware on this line. So I'm going to save this. So now we save this, and then let's test it. What are we testing? Oh, we are this. So let's make a request. You see now that the user property contains everything that we need. But then I don't think we're going to need any information like this. So we're probably going to need the email and the ID in the other middleware. So we shouldn't be returning things like password, the active flag, and created and updated ad. So we can specify in here where we can pass in another option here and say only return this property together with the ID. So by default it's gonna return the ID, and then here we say also return the email. So we should be able to get the email and the ID, because those are the only two values we can use to identify or uniquely identify the user in the database, right? So yeah, that's it. Let's test it for the last time. So now that we have attached this, let me give an example. Now that we have attached this user on this request interface, it means if ever that we want to return information that is related only to this user, we can just grab it from this request object and get the ID, and so that we can return information that is only or that should be accessed by this user. Right now that we're connected, go back here and run. So you see we are only getting the email and the ID. So yeah, that's basically it. You saw how we have protected this route. So in the next video we are going to implement more function related to the user, like something like things like update user, delete user, or get user. So we're going to implement those functions, right? And then those functions, we should be able to protect them, because not everyone should be able to delete update, because we need to make sure that indeed you are registered. So that's why we implemented the authentication middleware first. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this, guys. So yeah, please hit that subscribe button. I'll see you guys in the next video. Thank you.